Okay, can you all hear me? Good. I won't take much of your time because I want to leave for Dr. Gerber, but I wanted to make you aware that if you enjoyed today's presentation and want a little more expanded view, a little more relaxed atmosphere, Dr. Gerber will be presenting this evening at the Durango Public Library from 5:30 to 7 as well. What I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Gerber. Dr. Gerber is, as he bills himself up in the Front Range, Denver's diet doctor. He's board certified in family practice, been practicing up in the Front Range since 1993. I know that for all of us with the increase in chronic disease, particularly the big obesity word today, there's lots of controversy regarding what's healthy. And Dr. Gerber is planning to give us the scientific basis for an alternative nutritional concept that may provide us some answers for why we are where we are today with our health status in our country. Dr. Gerber.
Thank you, Carmen, for that introduction. I also want to thank Mi-Young. These two individuals are both very progressive when it comes to nutrition. So today our topic is fat reform, and it's really a topic about better nutrition and the problem with dietary carbohydrates. But we also want to answer the question, why and how has nutrition changed significantly in the last century? And this change, unfortunately, has been detrimental to our health and also costly as we spend more money at the doctor's office treating the complications of obesity. So we're going to be looking for some solutions, some answers, and we want to explore the science of nutrition and hopefully come up with some revised dietary guidelines. So my disclosure is I'm not promoting any expensive medical therapies, medications. I'm just promoting better health through better nutrition. So our outline today, basically 4 areas, and I hope we can get through it. We're going to look at some of the history and the politics of nutrition. Then we're going to get into the science. We're going to hopefully rewrite the nutritional guidelines. At the end, we'll summarize and we'll come up with some type of possible action plans. So there's this twin epidemic called diabesity. And this term tells us that there's a relationship between the two conditions, diabesity and obesity. In fact, I see it as a progression of the same condition. And that condition is called insulin resistance, and we're going to talk about it. And what's important to understand is that these epidemics are not coincidental, and the risk of developing diabetes is common. So some statistics. As you know, we're one of the world leaders. When we look at obesity statistics, we're probably number 2 and 3. We're fighting with actually the Persian Gulf countries, the oil countries. But when it comes to overweight, all these countries are equivalent. There's let me back up. There's one exception, and that's the South Pacific, where the, oh, hello. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. They tell me I don't have a loud voice. This will help quite a bit. So the one exception is the South Pacific countries, and their traditional diet is starch-based from the taro root. And so the American Samoas, native Hawaiians have a significant problem with obesity. There may be some genetic factors, but their traditional diet combined with modern nutrition, refined and processed foods, it's particularly worse. And unfortunately, we can export obesity out of our country as we send food out of our country. And in a sense, we import it as people move into our country, they develop obesity. So the Trust for American Health, I checked the statistic, and in 2011, again, they give us an F as in fat, a failing grade. The statistics say that 2/3 of the population are overweight, and we use the body mass index, which is a height to weight measurement of over 25, and 34% of adults are obese. Colorado, perhaps we should be proud that we're the thinnest state in the country, but when we go into the urban centers, we realize that we have a problem similar to the rest of the country. I think the most important thing on this slide is since 1980, something has happened. The obesity rate has doubled in adults and tripled in children. So in our lifetime, I mean in less than our lifetime, there's a major epidemic going on, and we want to understand why. So I just said that 2/3 of the population are overweight. I believe that that actually represents insulin resistance. And the diabetes statistics continue to get worse. We see more and more patients over age 60 that are diabetic. And if we don't do something about it, they're estimating that 1 in 3 children will be diabetic in 40 years. So that's 1/3 of the population. So when we talk about the history of nutrition, the ageless question is whether or not obesity is the result of behavior or is it a disease? And Ricky Gervais would like to offer his opinion. Oh, back up. Just click on it.
One of the few pleasures of fame is that you can do good things, but in all honesty, I think some causes are more worthy than others. Joking aside, cancer is a very worthy cause, autism is a very worthy cause. But I got asked to do a benefit gig recently for sufferers of obesity. What? For sufferers of obesity. I went, you mean fat people? She went, no, because obesity is, well, she actually went, no, because obesity, she was eating, of course. She was peckish between snacks, and but she said obesity is a disease. No, it's not, is it? You just like eating, don't you? No, it's not, is it?
Okay, so unfortunately, it's views of this condition that create barriers to treatment. And Ricky's certainly funny, but we take issue with what he's saying. But guess what? He's really right. That's how we have viewed obesity for most of the last 100 years, that we blame the individual. It's due to lifestyle choice. We eat too much. We exercise too little. It's the two great sins of gluttony and sloth. It's your fault. And in fact, the researchers are convinced. They are so convinced that it's a behavior problem. They call it a risk factor. And the science that they use to convince us is that of the first law of thermodynamics. And it's basically energy balance, which I just said above, that we eat too much and we exercise too little. And it's not a medical condition. And that begins the separation of the treatment of obesity and the healthcare system. They're two separate entities, and I think that's so wrong. So, but anyway, what we get out of this is the billion-dollar weight loss industry in the 1960s. We have many other examples. Some of my colleagues and I referred to the low-fat, low-calorie craze as the greatest fad diets of all time. They've even convinced the federal government of this. And I'll say it again, low-fat, low-calorie fad diet. So, but this is your problem, your responsibility. We're going to blame you, and you have to pay out of pocket. So let's look at the nutritional timeline. And we really call it a political timeline for one simple reason. It is the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, that is providing to us food and trying to tell us that the food that they're providing to us is healthy and safe. And that's really akin to the tobacco industry telling us that smoking light cigarettes is healthy, so we should smoke more of it. So we call that self-policing, and that's dangerous. But these guidelines, these nutritional guidelines, they really start post-World War II, where we're looking to eradicate malnutrition. And then a scientist by the name of Ansel Keys, who's a food scientist, who is famous for actually K rations. He actually invents the body mass index, and then later Mediterranean diet. But he comes up with a theory of the lipid hypothesis, and we're all familiar with it. And that hypothesis goes that eating saturated fat in your diet will elevate cholesterol, and it will lead to heart attack and stroke. So with his support from the federal government, he does a pretty ominous study. He starts in 1958. It's a 12-year study, and he eventually publishes the study in 1980. He gets written up in Time magazine to support the lipid hypothesis. And the study is called the 7-country study, except there's one problem. This is one of the worst scientific evidence-based studies out there. In fact, if he submitted it today, they might consider submitting it as an observation, but here's the big problem. It really should have been the 22-country study. And what he did was he threw out 15 countries that didn't fit into his hypothesis. And that basically ruins it for me. Okay, so then he handpicks the 7 countries, and he shows perhaps that there's this beautiful relationship between saturated fat and heart disease, but it's meaningless. He didn't prove anything, and we have tried over and over to again prove this hypothesis, even today, and we have not been able to prove it. It is inconclusive. Saturated fat has never been shown to cause heart disease. But guess what? The government wants to believe this study, and so it becomes policy. So we have the McGovern Committee in 1977 that, along with the lipid hypothesis, they promote low fat, low calorie. They are saying to cut back on sugars, so that's a good thing. And then in 1980, we get more official guidelines. And you remember I said in 1980 the obesity rate doubled and tripled? So we have these guidelines there that again say to decrease fat, increase carbohydrate, and guess what? Vegetable oils come out of the low-fat industry. They're manufactured oils. We used other fats prior to 1910, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So then we get the carbohydrate-heavy food pyramid. It's modified. Now we have my plate. And it's just interesting to notice that this carbohydrate-heavy food pyramid parallels the predominant food source, which is grains, predominantly carbohydrate. So we're left with 3 basic principles of nutrition. We just talked about the lipid hypothesis. The second is if you eat fat, you're going to get fat. So you have to reduce calories in your diet. And the third principle is the first law of thermodynamics, that we have to eat less and exercise more. But I tell you, the first law of thermodynamics is too simple an explanation. We are talking about human biologic systems. We're talking about physiology. So for instance, the first law of thermodynamics doesn't explain why we're hungry. And as you'll see, metabolism explains why we're hungry. So we have weak scientific evidence. We call it bad science, and is really providing us with the wrong tools. And so basically, we're telling patients to not eat, to reduce calories, and nobody can sustain that. And I think as a healthcare professional, we're as frustrated as the patients because we know that it doesn't work, and I see my colleagues give up. But what I offer is a new approach to this. So agriculture. So what we notice is there's a shift in nutrition 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, and the farmers learn how to produce in large scale. And they're looking for cost-effective materials, and guess what? They get it from mainly grains and sugar. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit. So the grain we're talking about, and these are big commodities today, include corn, wheat, rice, soy, the sugar that comes from cane or beet. And again, let's look at the nutrient content. So some of these sources are either pure carbohydrate or mostly carbohydrate. There's some protein, but when you talk about wheat, for instance, there's concerns about inflammation associated with these grain proteins from the glutens, from the lectins, and so there's some issues there. Rice and soy start from Asia, and then they come into the country here. And then, of course, there's sugar. So there's some trace minerals. The only benefit that I see is the one at the end, the fiber. And so what I like is I go for psyllium husk, and I go for the fiber that doesn't have any impact on blood sugar. But the rest of it isn't healthy, isn't really helping us in any other way. But the farmers don't produce as much of the nutrient dense or the whole food. So the animals, the vegetables, and fruits kind of fade away, and the grains and the sugars are growing and growing. And that's kind of been the trend that's snowballed. Now, this slide isn't to attack the farmers. The farmers are hardworking people, but they're looking to survive. And the food scientists are trying to increase yield. And as a result, they're modifying the food that we eat. Now, it starts with cross-germination, but in the 70s, we now have this genetically modified organism. And the idea is that this may be adversely impacting our health as they're increasing the taste, the sugar content of the food, and it's wreaking havoc on our metabolism. So another way to look at this is human evolution. And when you look at the primal man that spanned over 2.6 million years during the Paleolithic era, he was a hunter-gatherer. He was opportunistic. He was an omnivore. And he ate what was available to him. But we know from radioisotope studies that of the fossils that they primarily ate animals. And the foods most likely that he ate were animals, nuts, roots, vegetables, and fruit. Now, when the Neolithic period comes some 10,000 years ago, as we come out of the Stone Age, we see early farming. And guess what they start to farm? Grain. And there's an argument that we should eat more like the Paleolithic man, and there's this movement, the Paleolithic diet, based on some of these principles. Now, I do like some of the principles, some of the concepts there. In particular, eating whole, unprocessed foods. But clearly, primal man ate differently, or we ate differently for 99% of our existence. And it's really modern society that floods our food supply with carbohydrates. So the food industry, the manufacturers, wholesale, retail, they are in the business of selling food. And if you think for a minute that they're trying to make you healthy, you would be incorrect. So they're looking for inexpensive supplies, and they find that if they refine and process carbohydrate, they can even make it more profitable. The problem is when you refine and process carbohydrate, it releases the sugars even more. So it's unhealthy. So we're going to talk about there is a combination of sugar and fat, which is in virtually every processed food out there. We call this the killer combination, and we'll get back to that, but that's what they're trying to sell us. And so this deceptive advertising to make a health claim so that they can promote their food. And of course we have lobbyists and special interest groups that are funding the government for projects to help them to sell this unhealthy food. And again, it's all about selling food. It's not about our health. So let's talk about the cost of health care. And we are the world leader. And I don't think it's a good thing. But this slide that we obtained from the World Health Organization looks at the per capita cost of health care over the last 50 years. And basically, in 1980, they deregulate the healthcare industry. And you can see that, unfortunately, it's had a negative effect. And so we're spending now in 2008, this data is from almost twice the per capita of other countries. You can also look at this in terms of GDP to that considers different economies, and you also get the sense that there's a point of diminishing returns here. But how does obesity play into this? And intuitively, you would think that treating the complications of obesity is costing us a lot of money. And you'd be right, but there's not a lot of data out there. So I obtained some data from 2008, and in this study, it was suggested that obese individuals spend 42% more on healthcare than lean individuals. And I think that's an underestimation. So what do we get for all this money that we're spending on healthcare? And we get our wonderful healthcare system that is mandated by the CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid. And they set guidelines for the industry, as you know, both public and private. And they tell us that they're going to pay for the treatment of illness and disease only. And since obesity is not a medical condition, my goodness, it's a behavioral problem. We're not going to deal with that. So there's no incentive for providers. Worse than that, in medical school, they don't teach us anything about nutrition. If we don't know anything, we're not being incented, so why should we deal with it? How wrong is that? But they're going to pay for gastric bypass, they'll pay for cardiac surgery, they'll pay for expensive drugs to treat heart disease, diabetes. What's interesting is last year, just in November, they finally decided, you know, maybe we should pay attention to this obesity issue, and they've decided to include reimbursement for screening and treatment of obesity. But guess what? Nobody knows what to do with it. I think I have some ideas, but it's almost too late. But it is a step in the right direction. But the point is that our healthcare system is reactive, and we all know we need to change that. And you know, the bottom line, I hate to stand up and tell you that this is the complications, treating the complications of obesity is profitable, but it is. And that's why we all have a job. But I would tell you that I think money and my time is much better spent on the preventive side of things. Right? Yeah, okay. So, this is what we've become, and I have to thank my my colleague, Dr. Andreas Enfeld from Sweden. There is a big low-carb push in the Scandinavian countries, and he has played a large part of that. And this is the front page of his book, The Food Revolution. And he gave me permission to use the front page. But basically, we have artificially manufactured nutrition in our lifetime, and we've created our little John Candy man, I call him, the unfortunate late great John Candy, who died of a heart attack because of the carbohydrate that he is consuming, and we're left treating all the complications. And so the question is that how our society wants to operate? We want to just let people be unhealthy and we'll just throw medications and medical procedures at them. That's not right. We really have to understand the new scientific principles of nutrition. So this really just summarizes what I said, that there's this shift away from nutrient-dense foods to basically carbohydrate. We have to blame bad science providing us with the wrong tools. The problem is metabolism. We can't blame behavior. Metabolism makes us hungry. Genetics contribute, and we see variation from one ethnic group to the other. We have to consider that. But we've been brainwashed. So this low-fat, low-calorie mentality is so intertwined into the fabric of our society that we can't break free of it. Let's break free. We talked about this economic pressure to live unhealthy, and the healthcare industry. Again, we're just as guilty because, and not on purpose. We were using the same the official guidelines, but they're making our patients sick. And the same is true of the pharmaceutical industry. It's not a conspiracy. We're just using the official tools that are the wrong tools. So, fat reform is healthcare reform. And I'm not a politician. But if we address obesity, we're going to control the cost of healthcare. The primary targets are treating overweight and obesity, and it's appropriately funded by the healthcare system. Here's a good one. The healthcare industry, or those most interested in our health, regulate the food industry. Thank you and good night. So let's spend more money on prevention, and we can reduce the billions of dollars treating complications. Let's redefine healthy nutrition. And the goal is clearly promoting wellness, prevention, and longevity. We have to re-educate. We have to talk about the science of nutrition, which we're going to do in a minute. And we're going to discuss food metabolism. We're going to look at some scientific evidence and explain what is wrong with dietary carbohydrates. So a little bit of science. So all macronutrients are not the same. And what I'd like to do is convince you that carbohydrates are fattening and inflammatory, and fat and protein is not. So obesity, we disagree, Ricky Gervais. It is a metabolic disease. And the two conditions we're going to talk about is insulin resistance, this progressive condition, and inflammation. So this slide really explains metabolism. And the role of insulin, which is produced by the pancreas, the beta cells of course, is to regulate energy and regulate food energy. Yes, it regulates insulin, and we all learned that, and it regulates blood sugar, but what I think of the role of insulin is it regulates energy in our body. And the primary trigger for insulin is carbohydrate, because it's a simple, pure form of energy. No more, no less. And again, keep this concept in mind that when you consume carbohydrates, it turns on the insulin switch. And dietary protein and fat don't do that. And this is basic physiology. In fact, there's another purpose for dietary fat and protein. It's an essential building block of our body. Guess what? Carbohydrate's optional. I was actually thinking about this slide when I flew in this morning. I was having my 2 Egg McMuffins without the McMuffins, and I said, I changed my meal. I took away the carbohydrate. And if you measured my insulin, not much would happen. If I had put the McMuffins on there, my insulin would have gone crazy, and my blood sugars. And that's metabolism right there. That's a simple explanation on one slide, but we'll elaborate. So, there's insulin receptors on lean body tissue, on the fat tissue. And when insulin rises, it's a signal to the tissues that there's food energy available in the bloodstream. Insulin attaches to those receptors, and first the lean body tissue will absorb the food energy to a meal, and then if there's extra energy, it'll be converted in the liver through beta cells and glucagon into fat, and then it gets stored into the fat cells. And as you know, the fat tissue can grow and grow as there's more food energy available. When insulin as insulin rises, it would make sense. It's a negative feedback mechanism. It suppresses appetite. When food is unavailable, the reverse happens. And this is what we see in between meals, where insulin level is low, and that is a signal to actually use stored energy. So we release energy from fat cells. If there's a small supply of glycogen, we'll do that as well. But again, it's dietary carbohydrate that's the primary trigger, not fat and not protein. So now we imagine that we overeat. We have a lot of excess energy, insulin levels rise, and we store that energy in body fat. Now we have a larger body mass because we gained weight. So when we eat again, now we even need to produce more insulin because of this larger body mass. We store the extra energy as body fat, and we gain weight, and we need to produce more insulin. The beta cells that produce the insulin, they have to work harder. Now just imagine years of carbohydrate overload. The system gets overstimulated. In fact, the insulin receptors become resistant, they don't work properly. The beta cells become, well, they're not resistant, but they don't behave in a proper manner. And it's this, it creates this vicious cycle. And hunger is a part of that, and that's what this slide demonstrates. We gain weight, it worsens insulin resistance, we have to create more insulin. And again, carbohydrates triggering this, not fat and protein. Another way to look at this, on the left slide we have the normal individual, the green arrows are normal insulin production, and the fat cells are on the bottom left, normal weight individual. Now we're insulin resistant. Our body fat has doubled in size, and I apologize to the guys over here. There's only one of me. It's doubled in size. We're insulin resistant, so we have to produce more insulin. In fact, most of the insulin is going to the fat cells. In fact, most of the energy that we consume is going to the fat cells. And so that's another way to understand insulin resistance. So hunger and appetite. I talked about this for a second in the beginning. Insulin resistance makes us hungry. And I just showed in that last slide, all the energy that we consume is going to the fat cells. So that's why overweight people are hungry and have no energy. We get resistance centrally in the hypothalamus. First we get these rapid rises and dips in the blood sugar and insulin level. We're hungry, we eat, we overeat, we fall asleep, we wake up, we eat again, and it's that's a direct effect. Then we get, in a sense, direct insulin resistance in the brain, either directly or indirectly through other hormones that we can show you in a minute. And we even get a pathologic response where the hunger centers of the brain don't even respond to food that we consume. And all we are left with is our expanding stomach as we overeat, as a sense of fullness. So I hope that I've explained to you that it's metabolism that makes us hungry. It has nothing to do with that first law. So this slide shows that insulin is only one of many hormones that regulate food intake. And we talk about insulin because it's probably the most important and it's the most common. But this is science for the future and science for the day. For today, we actually have some GLP-1 and amylin drugs that are smart hormonal drugs that are out on the market now that we are using to help people with obesity and weight issues and diabetes. So there's a whole other way to look at the metabolism of this. And this is a disease of the fat cells themselves, the adipose tissue. And what they're doing is they release toxic substances. So when your weight is normal, your fat cells are quiet, minding their own business. As we gain weight, they begin to release these toxic substances, of which most are harmful. In fact, free fatty acids are just lipids that aren't in that tri-configuration. And those free fatty acids that float around in the blood are directly inflammatory to the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, vis-a-vis atherosclerosis. We have these inflammatory signals or hormones, cytokines, and we'll look at those in a second, that are released by the fat cells. And it further fuels insulin resistance and inflammation. And we can think of this again as a disease of energy overload. And I like the term energy storage disease. And when I talk about inflammation, I'm talking about the kind of inflammation that causes atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, and pretty much everything else in modern medicine. And so this is another way to view this disease, a disease of energy overload. And we have the fat cells in the center, and it's releasing these toxic hormonal signals that lead to these medical conditions that we treat each and every day. And if we take it one step further, you could pretty much put any medical disease here of a modern society on this slide and relate it back to obesity, insulin resistance. So let's talk about evaluating patients. And this is a new approach. Before I learned about nutrition, I didn't understand that there was this connection between obesity and diabetes. But now there is. And we understand that it's a progressive condition that we're treating. And the best tool in the office is to measure the patient's weight, BMI, body fat. We do want to get a history. Comorbidities, what are their medications. We do an awful lot of oral glucose tolerance testing as a screening tool. Medicare actually does recommend it. And then we measure metabolic markers of inflammation. And just one word about lipid profile. I think lipid profile is a metabolic marker of inflammation. I do not believe that cholesterol causes heart disease. I believe that inflammation causes heart disease. And that's probably a big one for some of you to swallow. But it brings us back to the metabolism. And the degree of insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction really guides our treatment guidelines. So in the fun part, again, it's not about medication, it's about the food. And we simply want to remove the fuel, the dietary carbohydrates. It turns off the insulin switch. Stored energy will be released from the adipose tissue through beta oxidation. And we call that lipolysis. If there's a rapid release, we call that healthy ketosis. And it promotes weight loss. Inflammatory signals diminish. We improve insulin resistance and pancreatic function. And if you don't believe me, you can actually measure triglycerides on patients that you remove carbohydrates and you put them on a protein-fat diet, and the numbers drop. But wait, they're releasing fat from adipose tissue. Yes, but remember we're treating energy overload. So we're in a whole different realm. So this is going to control hunger and appetite. We talked about that. Initially, we get some carbohydrate withdrawal when we put patients on this type of plan. Imagine they're addicted to carbohydrate for years, and it's almost taking them off of their drug of choice. And we support them through this period of time. It may be a couple days, a couple weeks. But then the body, guess what? It learns to burn body fat. It says, there's no more fuel coming from the outside. There's no more carbohydrate. We're going to start burning body fat for energy. And actually, body fat or beta oxidation may be the preferred method for energy in our body because it's sustainable. It doesn't come in bursts like carbohydrate. So that's something to think about. And again, carbohydrate is a non-essential fuel. It's optional, and we eat too much of it. So, dietary protein. We want to increase protein in the diet so we don't lose muscle mass. Now, I'm not saying this is a meat fest, and with all respect to vegetarians, we even try to work with vegetarians that are trying to reduce carbohydrate in their diet. Dietary fat and cholesterol. If you understand insulin metabolism, you understand why I would say that fat is not the inflammatory fuel, and it's healthy. Dietary fat does not cause heart attacks and does not cause strokes. It's nutrient dense, it's filling. There's one exception, and I mentioned this before. This killer combination of carbs and fat. And this is the typical American diet. And what happens is that we eat this combination of food. Carbohydrates are the catalyst, and they turn on that insulin switch. And so now the body's converting the carbs to fat and storing it. We also ate a bolus of fat, and now it has to store that. The body's in inflammatory mode. So this is a double negative. And I think that Chef Paula Deen taught us how to do this with her glazed donuts and cheeseburger sandwich. Oh my goodness. So we can use medication. We're looking for smart hormonal drugs, Byetta, Victoza, Similan, Bidurian. I know I'm not I'm not promoting medication, but these are some wonderful drugs that came out in 2005, and they're smart hormonal drugs. They're not appetite suppressants. And they're really addressing these complicated metabolic pathways that we're trying to correct. So we treat the comorbid conditions. And this is, we're not calling this good medicine. I mean, we all want to practice good medicine, but this is understanding that it's nutrition is the first tool. And then I just put gastric bypass surgery on the bottom, but that's really an artificial way to treat this condition. Okay, so this is fun here. We'll talk about counseling. And this is how I talk to my patients in the office as if you were sitting there right now. We talk about how to focus on the carbohydrate content of food. And the one tool that we start with is the glycemic index. That's a measurement of a food's ability to rapidly raise blood sugar. So foods that have a high glycemic index are bad. And we focus on glycemic index foods under 30. Typically the index says that under 55 is a healthy food, but they weren't considering what I just talked to you about, insulin metabolism. That would allow you to eat too much carbohydrate. So we want to avoid the high glycemic index foods. And again, they come from grain and sugar. Okay, and the examples are hidden sugars, high fructose corn syrup, corn byproducts, bread, pasta, rice, toast, cereal, bagels. We don't like starchy vegetables like potatoes. Milk is bad and cheese is good. So the more liquid in a dairy product, the more sugar. What we want to do is eat low glycemic foods. Again, they're nutrient dense, they're filling, they're not processed. And examples, the animal protein, beef, chicken, fish, porks, certain vegetables, green leafy vegetables, certain fruits, fibrous fruits, nuts, cheese, heavy cream. My daughter asked me to make sure to write heavy cream in there, because that gets an ooh from the audience. It's low glycemic. What can I say? Beans and eggs. The paleo people have problems with beans. They're concerns that they have protein qualities similar to the grains. We want to eat, again, the whole nutrient-dense foods. Dietary fat and cholesterol. Again, it's low glycemic. It's not fattening. It's not inflammatory. There's a reason that animal protein is surrounded by saturated fat, because it's good for us. The caveman wasn't cutting away the fat when he sat down for his meal. In fact, he ate the whole animal. This is a big one for some people to swallow. All fats are good because they do not stimulate insulin. They do not cause insulin resistance. And I think that in the order that I listed is how we should be consuming our oils and fats. And it starts with saturated fat, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. It is nutrient dense. If a patient's hungry and you want to fill them up quick, have them eat some more fat. And examples are butter, coconut oil, olive oil, avocado. And again, just understand that vegetable oil is manufactured from seeds, because Ansel Keys told us that we shouldn't eat that saturated fat. So they wanted, and guess what? Butter, animal fat is very expensive. So they artificially manufactured vegetable oils. The same thinking that went into our trans fats. Now, not to say that vegetable oil is bad, but I'm just making the point that over the last 100 years we decided let's mess with our nutrition, and look where we've gotten. Other tools. So, and also to avoid eating that killer combination of carbs and fats. So we can count grams of carbohydrate. If we have some patients that are having some challenges with weight loss, we can get even more restrictive, and that's where you can start to count the grams of carbohydrate. There's another tool, glycemic load. I don't particularly like to use that. We're trying to encourage patients to eat low glycemic, nutrient-dense food. It controls the appetite. And guess what? We don't talk to our patients that much about quantity, calories, and portion. It takes care of itself. We're using physiology to our benefit. So I like to compare diets in the office, and on the one extreme we have the very low-fat, high-carb diet, which is the Dean Ornish and the Pritikin, and unfortunately you're very hungry on these diets. And I think I just explained why the old principles of nutrition don't work. There's no scientific basis for them. Then there's everything in between, and then just on the other extreme we have the high-fat, low-carb, such as Atkins or the Bernstein diet. Again, this is where you get this rapid weight loss, and they call it a healthy ketogenic diet. And then there's the paleo diet. There's so many diets. My argument is there shouldn't be any more diets. There should just be adequate, proper nutrition, and everyone understands this, and it starts in elementary school. They teach nutrition from the get-go, proper nutrition. So what diets are healthy or safe? And we want to support anything that works, but as a physician, we want to monitor the metabolic markers. And I'd like to provide you with some scientific evidence. And what the studies show, we have over 100 studies now comparing low carb to low fat. And the low carb diets are winning out, both in weight reduction and markers of inflammation. So this study was the A to Z weight loss study from Stanford, where they looked at 250 women that they studied over 12 months. And there's 4 diets. We have Atkins on the low carb side, then we have Zone, Learn, and the Ornish diet is on the other extreme. And what you can see on the bottom is at 6 months, the triangle is the Atkins diet, where they lost the most amount of weight, and then that was sustained over 12 months. Now what I think is most interesting is that everyone stuck to all the principles of the diet. The low-fat people controlled the calories and the quantity and the content, and the Atkins people, they just ate fatty foods. You know, we're talking extreme Atkins diet. And when they looked at the data, both groups ate the same amount of calories, and yet the Atkins lost more weight. So that really disproves thermodynamics, and that we're using metabolism and physiology to our advantage, and that's what this slide is showing us. So metabolic markers, I know this is a medical group, and we could really get into this, but basically on the left is the Atkins group, and on the right is the Ornish group. But in the Atkins group, with the exception of a slight elevation in the LDL cholesterol, HDL went up 5%, triglycerides went down, non-HDL cholesterol went down. We're going to talk a little bit about LDL. This is the old science. We really want to look at particle size nowadays. And I'm going to just say it right now. On an Atkins diet, the particles get pattern A, fluffy, big, healthy. So on the Ornish diet, okay, all the numbers went down, but the HDL went down. And I think that HDL is doubly protective compared to LDL. So this kind of profile we see in a very common pattern. This pattern is cachexic, sick patients in the hospital. And so if I have a choice, I want my profile to look like this, the Atkins profile. And this slide just shows as triglycerides, as triglycerides drop, particle size improves. And that's what we see on the Atkins diet. So, okay, I actually got through it, and I was going to show, it's 1 o'clock. I was going to show a couple patients. Let me just do it real quick. All these patients have given me permission, and they're on the internet. Marcia is 45. I had known her for 6 years. She first came in, and we put her, and she had some inflammatory conditions, some food sensitivity. She was on Nexium, Crestor, multiple medications. And we put her on a low-carb diet, and she lost 30 pounds, but then she had a balance problem for a couple years, and then she came back and she says, I'm motivated again. And she actually got some help from an author, Melissa Diane Smith, who writes a book, Against the Grain. And Marcia, because of her sensitivities, got very hardcore, and she got into this whole paleo-primal type of approach, but she also cut out legumes and beans. She cut out dairy products. So really hardcore. I think it was challenging, but I'll show you in a minute. She lost 70 pounds in 8 months. But what we notice is her cholesterol profile improves. We stopped all of her medications. Her HDL came up a little bit. I was surprised that it didn't come up more than it did. And she feels great and she needs to continue. And so this is Marcia before and after. So she's done well. I have had some of my patients come to the lectures. David, so I'll talk about David. David is a medical writer. He made his diabetes international, and he writes about it on the internet. He has the best glycemic index in the world on his website, and I have links to his website. But he had come in, he'd been diabetic for 10, 15 years, and he knew that I was into nutrition. There were some of these new GLP-1s, drugs that were on the market. Byetta was the first, and he wanted to get on it. So, David's favorite hobby then was to be in the I think it's the Mensa Diner in Boulder, and he'd hang out there and eat. So he comes in at 312 pounds. He's just on metformin, and he meets all the criteria for type 2 diabetes. And we treat him with carbohydrate restriction and Byetta. And 2 years went by. He basically lost half his body weight. He actually started with a glycemic index diet, and then he went into a low-carb diet. And no medication. His A1C is 4.6. His cholesterol profile is great. And I can't detect diabetes in him. And so this is David now. He lost half his body. So I think he's coming to our next lecture. So, okay, so I'm just going to skip. This is Patrick. Well, he lost 40 pounds. He's a radio announcer in Denver. And he says, I never knew, Dr. Gerber, that I could lose weight by eating. And I said, that's how it's supposed to work, Pat. So if you want to learn more about the science of bad medicine, or bad nutrition rather, Gary Taubes is one of my favorite authors. There's many leaders out there. But I've certainly done my homework, and I continue to research. So fat reform is healthcare reform. We want to redefine healthy nutrition using the right tools. We want to rebalance this carbohydrate-heavy food pyramid. And this is a low glycemic or a low-carb pyramid. If you notice, this one I liked. It's got vegetables on the bottom instead of the meats. We're going to focus on glycemic index and healthy food choices. We want unprocessed whole foods, green leafy vegetables, fibrous fruit. We're going to control appetite with this low glycemic diet. We want to exercise, and we want to restrict carbs prior to going to the gym. If we have to lose weight, we want to teach the body to burn body fat. If there's sugar, if there's carbohydrate, if there's glycogen on board, you're not going to burn body fat. We want to. The long-term goals are prevention, health, quality of life. We need to take action, and I've actually talked to some of the people in the audience today that understand these new principles, and we need to team up, perhaps a grassroots effort, because we are a small group against the gorilla. And we really need to make change. I think it's very important. So I'm trying to get involved at a state level, collaborate with colleagues. Bridget Hart is a low-carb personal chef who knows a lot about nutrition, and we're trying to work things together. Healthcare professionals need to embrace this because this is a tool that will work, and we want to control the cost of healthcare, obviously. And so I think the grassroots effort's important. If you think I said anything that made sense, go to my Facebook page, like my page, tell your friends. This grassroots effort, social media is a powerful tool, and I have a lot of other useful information on my website. So that's all I have. Thank you so much.